The sheriff's deputy stood staring at the huge stack of neatly arranged plastic bins covering my neighbor's front porch. He scratched the back of his neck, glanced over at me, and gave me the kind of look that said he already knew exactly how this whole situation had unfolded before anyone even opened their mouth. My neighbor kept shouting that I was harassing him, trespassing, and acting completely crazy, but the deputy ignored the outburst and calmly asked just one question. "Do all of these items belong to you?" The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like forever. Right then, I realized everything had finally come full circle. Just 3 months earlier, I never would have believed something like this could happen. I wasn't searching for trouble. I wasn't trying to prove a point. And I certainly never imagined I'd be the man dropping 50 containers of garbage onto someone's porch before sunrise. I was simply a middle-aged farmer who appreciated peaceful mornings, fresh-picked tomatoes, and neighbors who respected property lines. My name is Ethan Walker, and I own a little over 5 acres outside Temple, Texas, about an hour north of Austin. It isn't a fancy place, just a stretch of open pasture that I've slowly transformed into something I'm proud of since buying it in 2018. I built raised garden beds, a chicken coop my nephew helped put together one summer, planted a couple of pecan trees that finally started producing good harvests, and kept enough open land to remind me every evening why I walked away from city life. I spent 20 years working in commercial construction before deciding I'd rather earn a little less and enjoy a lot more peace. Out here, people usually wave when they drive by. If a storm knocks down someone's fence, neighbors show up with tools before anyone even asks for help. That's the way this community has always been. The family who lived next door before, the Harpers, spent nearly 30 years there before retiring to Arkansas. We traded vegetables, borrowed each other's ladders, and watched over one another's homes while someone was away. We never once argued over the property line because we both believed in one simple rule. If it didn't belong to you, you left it alone. Then the Harpers sold the house to a young couple from Seattle named Logan and Madison Brooks. They couldn't have been much older than 30. They arrived with a beautiful house setup, an expensive pickup truck, 2 electric SUVs, and patio furniture that probably cost more than my tractor. I assumed they were remote workers looking for a quieter life after leaving the city behind, and honestly, I hope things worked out for them. Everyone deserves the chance to start over somewhere new. The first thing that caught my attention wasn't something they said. It was what they didn't say. About 4 days after moving in, I noticed them standing near the back property line holding tablets and taking pictures. I was watering my tomatoes roughly 100 yards away, so I gave them a friendly wave like any neighbor would. They looked directly at me, then turned back to their conversation without waving back. I brushed it off. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe they simply didn't notice. We all have awkward moments. Around 2 weeks later, I came home after buying chicken feed and immediately spotted something dark scattered across the edge of my pasture. At first, I assumed strong Texas winds had blown somebody's trash over from the highway. But as I got closer, I realized every single bag had been carefully lined up nearly 20 feet inside my property. There were 12 heavy contractor bags, broken shelves, smashed lamps, old computer monitors, and enough rotting food that I could smell it before I even stepped out of my truck. Flies swarmed over everything. One bag had already burst open, and stray dogs had dragged scraps across the grass I'd spent weeks keeping clean. I stood there for a full minute because my mind refused to believe what I was looking at. Nobody accidentally carries 12 garbage bags that deep onto someone else's land. That takes planning. That takes intention. I walked over to their house and knocked on the front door. About 30 seconds later, Logan answered wearing expensive workout clothes while holding a coffee mug, as though I'd interrupted something far more important. I stayed polite and said, "Hey, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Someone dumped a pile of trash on my property, and judging by what's inside those bags, I think it came from over here." He never even looked toward the backyard. He simply shrugged and said, "We figured that land wasn't really being used." For a moment, I honestly believed he was joking. I laughed once and replied, "Well, it is being used. It belongs to me." His smile immediately disappeared. "It's just an empty field," he said. I answered, "Private property doesn't stop being private just because nobody is standing on it all day. He stared at me in silence, slowly took another sip of his coffee, then casually replied, "I honestly don't see the problem." Before I could respond, he quietly shut the door right in my face. I stood there staring at my reflection in the glass for a few more seconds before turning around and heading home. I remember convincing myself he was probably embarrassed and had handled the situation badly. Maybe he'd come over later and apologize. Maybe one day we'd laugh about it while talking across the fence. Looking back, that was probably the last innocent thought I ever had about my new neighbors before everything spiraled into something none of us ever expected. The apology never came, though nothing changed. I watched from my barn as Logan drove right past the pile of trash without even tapping the brakes. Somehow that upset me more than the garbage itself because it proved this wasn't an accident or simple carelessness. It was pure entitlement. I spent most of that Saturday loading every bag into my utility trailer, wearing thick gloves because several of them had already started leaking. The smell was unbearable. Rotting food mixed with old paint, moldy carpet, and whatever chemicals were trapped inside those broken electronics. By the time I finished, sweat soaked through my shirt, dirt covered my boots, and my back was aching. But I also had clear photographs of everything, timestamps saved on my phone, and a county landfill receipt showing I had paid exactly $93.40 to dispose of it properly. My old construction foreman always told me that feelings fade away, but paperwork lasts forever. So after I got home, I scanned every receipt, printed a detailed invoice, and mailed it by certified mail along with a polite letter asking Logan and Madison to reimburse the cleanup costs within 10 business days. There wasn't a single angry sentence in that letter because I still believed reasonable people eventually made reasonable decisions. 10 business days passed without a response. Then another 2 weeks slipped by, and I almost convinced myself the whole situation had finally ended until I came home from my sister Claire's birthday dinner one Sunday afternoon. As I turned toward the back pasture, I slammed on my brakes so hard that my coffee splashed across the dashboard. Sitting nearly 25 feet inside my property was an old sectional couch, soaked from the recent rain with one armrest ripped wide open. Around it were piles of broken bathroom tiles, chunks of drywall, empty paint cans, splintered lumber, rusted plumbing fixtures, and what looked like the leftovers from a complete home renovation. Deep tire tracks cut across my grass, leaving muddy ruts nearly 6 inches deep. This time they hadn't simply tossed a few trash bags onto my land. They had driven a truck straight across my property, unloaded construction debris, and left without the slightest concern that the land belonged to someone else. I climbed out of my truck, slowly walked the area, photographed everything from every possible angle, measured the distances with the tape measure I always kept in my truck, and recorded a slow video showing the official property markers that had been installed years earlier when I purchased the land. Getting older changes the way anger works. At 25, I probably would have marched straight to their front door yelling. At 52, I understood that calm people usually win because they gather evidence while angry people create evidence against themselves. That evening, I called my attorney, Richard Holloway. Richard had spent nearly 20 years prosecuting property crimes before opening his own private practice. We had become friends after he helped me negotiate a commercial lease several years earlier, and there was one thing I always appreciated about him. He never rushed into court until the facts were stronger than the emotions. The following morning, he drove out to my property, walked the entire area with me, examined the tire tracks, studied the damaged couch, and quietly said, "Well, they've officially turned this from annoying into illegal." He explained that illegal dumping, trespassing, and property damage were all separate legal issues, especially because the truck had crushed part of the irrigation line feeding my vegetable garden. We documented every detail. Then Richard prepared a formal demand letter requiring them to remove all the debris immediately, reimburse me for the damages, and provide written confirmation that they would never trespass again. 3 days later, an overnight envelope arrived. It wasn't from Logan. It came from a law office in Portland. Apparently, Madison's uncle had connected them with an attorney back home. I sat across from Richard while he read the letter aloud. According to their lawyer, the exact property boundary was supposedly unclear. They claimed the land looked vacant and unused, and their clients believed they had acted in good faith regarding the practical use of the neighboring open space. Richard lowered the letter, looked at me over the top of his glasses, and quietly laughed. It wasn't loud or disrespectful. It was the kind of laugh someone lets out after hearing an argument so ridiculous it almost deserves applause. "Ethan," he said, "I've heard criminals come up with better stories than this." He pulled my property file from the cabinet, spread the official survey across his desk, and pointed to the steel survey markers, recorded coordinates, and county-approved documents that had all been filed years before Logan ever purchased the neighboring property. There was no mystery to solve because there had never been any mystery at all. That same week, Richard filed a lawsuit seeking compensation for trespassing, illegal dumping, cleanup costs, restoration of the damaged pasture, attorney fees, and punitive damages based on their repeated behavior. The total claim came to just under $13,000. The court date was scheduled 3 weeks later. During those weeks, something unexpected happened. Every evening, I walked past that growing mountain of junk, and instead of becoming more frustrated, I found myself getting calmer with each passing day. As I kept thinking about everything that had happened, one part of their attorney's letter kept replaying in my mind. They had never actually denied that the dumped items belonged to Logan and Madison. By claiming they had acted in good faith, they had indirectly admitted the property was theirs. One afternoon, Richard noticed the grin on my face and asked what was going through my mind. I told him, if the law says all of this is their property, maybe it ought to be returned to them. He stared at me for several long seconds before asking the only question that really mattered. "You're not planning to damage any of it, are you?" I shook my head. "No trespass. No, threaten them. Not even close." He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, sat quietly for another moment, and finally smiled. "Well," he said, "now I'm interested to see where this goes." The following morning I drove into town and bought 50 heavy-duty clear storage bins with locking lids. The cashier looked at the pile and jokingly asked if I was starting a warehouse. I smiled and replied, "Something like that." For almost 2 weeks my barn looked more like an evidence storage room than a farm building. Every evening after dinner I pulled on a pair of gloves, opened another section of the dumped debris, and sorted everything with care. Plastic bottles went into one container, aluminum cans into another, electrical cords were bundled neatly together, bathroom tiles were stacked by size, and paint cans were separated depending on whether they were full or empty. Broken shelving, curtain rods, light fixtures, cabinet hardware, loose screws, and rusty hinges all went into labeled zipper bags. Every container received a waterproof number, and I photographed everything inside before locking the lid. My niece Emily stopped by one afternoon and burst into laughter when she saw row after row of perfectly organized bins stretching across the barn floor. "Uncle Ethan," she said, "this doesn't look like revenge. It looks like the most organized garage sale anyone has ever seen." I laughed too because, honestly, she wasn't wrong. There was something strangely satisfying about taking the chaos they had created and turning it into perfect order. By the time I finished, I had a complete photographic inventory that matched every numbered container. Nothing had been thrown away. Nothing had been damaged. Every single item they had abandoned on my property was now cleaner, drier, and better organized than when they dumped it there. The afternoon before court, I rented a 20-foot box truck, carefully loaded every container with a hand dolly, checked my inventory sheets one last time, and went to bed feeling surprisingly calm. My alarm rang at 4:30 the next morning. The Texas sky was still dark as I drove toward their house with all 50 numbered containers secured inside the truck. Just after 6 o'clock, I parked legally along the road, lowered the loading ramp, and started carrying each bin one at a time. I wasn't making noise, and I wasn't rushing. I simply placed every container neatly across the front porch, filling both sides of the entrance before continuing the rows down the front walkway. The finished arrangement almost looked like a display. Perfectly straight lines of crystal-clear storage bins, every label facing forward, every lid locked tight. When I set down the final container, the front door could still crack open a few inches, but nobody was getting through without moving their own belongings first. I stepped back, took several photographs for my records, and just as I reached my truck, the curtains inside the house suddenly flew open. Madison looked outside, froze where she stood, and disappeared from view. A second later, the front door slammed into the wall of containers and stopped almost immediately. Logan's voice exploded from inside the house. "What the hell is this?" I calmly answered, "I'm returning your property." His face instantly turned bright red. "Get this junk off my porch." I slowly shook my head. "It stopped being my responsibility the day you dumped it on my land." Without another word, he pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the sheriff." I nodded once and replied, "That's probably the right thing to do." Then I leaned against my truck and waited while the morning sun slowly rose over the pasture, knowing the most important conversation of this entire story was only minutes away. About 15 minutes later, a McLennan County Sheriff's deputy pulled into the driveway, stepped out of his patrol vehicle, and spent several silent seconds staring at the wall of perfectly organized storage bins covering the Brooks family's front porch. I could almost see him trying to figure out exactly what he was looking at. Logan hurried over first, talking nonstop, pointing at me, accusing me of harassment, trespassing, intimidation, and just about every other accusation he could think of. The deputy listened patiently without interrupting, then walked over to me and asked, "Would you mind telling me your side of the story?" I handed him the folder Richard had told me to keep in my truck. Inside were dated photographs of the dumping, copies of the certified letters, the landfill receipt, the formal demand notice, the lawsuit filing, the property survey, and the complete inventory listing every numbered container and everything inside it. He stood there reading through the paperwork for several minutes while Logan became quieter with every passing second. Finally, the deputy looked up, turned toward Logan, and asked one simple question. "Sir, do these belongings belong to you?" Logan hesitated. It only lasted a moment, but that brief pause said everything. "Well, yes, most of them." The deputy slowly nodded. "And these items were originally left on Mr. Walker's property?" Another uncomfortable silence followed. "Yes, but..." Before he could finish, the deputy raised one hand and calmly said, "Then he's simply returning your property. I don't see any evidence that he damaged any of it." The deputy glanced at the neatly stacked containers one last time before smiling and saying something I still laugh about whenever I remember it. "Honestly, this is probably the most organized illegal dumping case I've ever seen." Then he wished both of us a good morning, climbed back into his patrol car, and drove away. Logan never said another word, and neither did I. There simply wasn't anything left to discuss. The following morning, Richard and I walked into the county courthouse carrying 2 bankers' boxes packed with documents. Across the courtroom sat Logan, Madison, and their attorney, who looked far less confident than he had in all of his letters. Judge Eleanor Hayes was known for being patient, but she had very little tolerance for anyone who wasted the court's time. Richard presented our case carefully and methodically, almost like he was teaching a class. He began with the photographs showing the original pile of dumped garbage. Next came the landfill receipt from my first cleanup. Then he introduced the certified mailing records proving they had been properly notified. After that, he presented the second set of photographs showing the construction debris, the damaged pasture, the deep tire tracks, and the broken irrigation line. Finally, he submitted the official county survey, complete with recorded coordinates and permanent survey markers. The judge studied every exhibit carefully before turning toward the defense. Their attorney repeated the same argument about uncertainty over the property line, but this time Judge Hayes opened the county's digital survey on the courtroom monitor. She zoomed in until every recorded boundary marker appeared on the screen, then compared it with the photographs we had submitted. After a long moment, she removed her reading glasses, looked directly at Logan, and calmly said, "Mr. Brooks, there is no uncertainty here. This property boundary has been professionally surveyed and legally recorded for years. Your truck crossed it repeatedly. Your household garbage crossed it repeatedly. Your construction debris crossed it repeatedly. The only thing that seems confused is your understanding of private property." The courtroom became so quiet I could hear papers being shuffled in the back row. She ruled completely in our favor, awarding reimbursement for the cleanup costs, restoration of my damaged pasture, attorney's fees, and additional damages, bringing the total judgment to just over $12,000. Then she added one final condition that neither side had requested. Since the dispute had been fueled by repeated claims of confusion over the boundary, both properties would receive permanent survey monuments and highly visible boundary markers installed by a licensed survey company at the Brooks family's expense. It was such a practical solution that even Richard smiled. About 3 weeks later, I watched a survey crew spend the entire day installing heavy steel monuments, bright orange witness posts, and permanent reference markers all along the property line. By the time they finished, you probably could have spotted that boundary from outer space. During the following month, something interesting happened. The arguments stopped. No more trash appeared on my land. No more trucks crossed onto my property. No more excuses were offered. We never became friends, and honestly, I never expected we would. We simply became neighbors who both understood exactly where one property ended and the other began. Sometimes that's more than enough. Before long, the grass covered the tire ruts again. I repaired the damaged irrigation line, expanded my vegetable garden, and built a second chicken run the following spring. Every now and then I'd see Logan outside while I was mowing, and we'd exchange a polite nod before going back to our own work. Nothing more. Maybe the lawsuit changed him, and maybe it didn't. The truth is, people only change when they choose to, and that's something no judge has the power to order. But one thing I know for certain is this. Respect usually arrives in one of two ways. It comes through good character or it comes through consequences. I'll always hope people choose the first. In our case, we ended up with the second. Looking back, people often ask whether carrying all those containers back to his porch was really worth the effort. My answer usually surprises them. It was never about revenge. If revenge had been my goal, I would have acted while I was still angry. Instead, I waited, documented everything, stayed completely within the law, and simply returned property to its rightful owner. Sometimes the most satisfying response isn't creating a bigger problem for someone else. It's making them accept responsibility for the problem they created themselves. Now I'd really like to know what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have handled things differently? Or do you believe returning every single piece of their own property was the fairest lesson possible? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always seem to split opinions right down the middle. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes good fences make good neighbors. Because in the end, clear boundaries make even better ones.